You are lying. The words cracked across the chamber like a war drum, rippling through the gathered assembly of alien delegates. Ambassador Ronan Dain remained seated, his fingers loosely intertwined, his posture deceptively relaxed. His eyes, dark as storm-tossed waters, studied his accuser with measured patience. Venzar Akesh, an Avarian warlord, leaned forward, his golden feathered arms coiled with tension. His talons tapped against the table's polished obsidian surface, slow and deliberate. No species should survive such conditions, Venzar continued, his voice thick with disdain. You expect us to believe your kind evolved on a world where nature itself is your greatest enemy? Ronan exhaled through his nose, a slow and calculated release of breath. The air in the chamber was different from Earth's, thinner, drier, tinged with something sharp that prickled against his lungs, a chemical sterility that had long purged weakness from this place. 47 species sat in this grand chamber of the Galactic Concordium, each occupying their designated space in the carefully balanced order of interstellar politics. To them, Earth was an anomaly, a backwater planet with an upstart species that had no business standing in this hall. And now, that upstart species was here, facing down the empires that had ruled the stars for millennia. You think I'm lying, Ronan repeated, his voice steady. Then tell me, Warlord, why am I here? If we were weak, as you claim, if my species was fragile, unfit to exist beyond our own atmosphere, how is it that we have crossed the void and stand before you now? A murmur of discontent slithered through the chamber. The air pulsed with a tension that hadn't existed moments ago, like the first static charge before a coming storm. Venzar's beak clicked sharply. Because your kind is lucky. Ronan smiled, but there was nothing kind in it. Luck is an excuse used by those who fear an answer they do not want to hear. Venzar's feathers flared in irritation. You claim survival, but survival is not dominance. Your people have no war fleets, no siege engines, no planetary weapons that rival the great empires. You are a speck in a cosmos of giants, yet you speak as if we should fear you. Ronan leaned forward, his movements controlled, deliberate. His voice dipped lower, forcing those around him to listen. Tell me, Warlord, how many predators stalked your ancestors before they discovered fire? The Avarian's head twitched slightly, his talons stilled. How often did your people fight starvation, not because of war, but because the very land beneath them refused to yield food? A slow, measured silence stretched between them. How many times, Ronan continued, did your kind live under skies that could turn to fire without warning, where the ground could split open and swallow entire cities? When was the last time your people faced an ocean that could wipe a continent clean in a single night? The chamber, which had been restless, now held an uneasy stillness. The shifting bodies, the twitching antennae, the flickering bioluminescence of species that communicated through light. It had all stilled, a silence thick enough to choke the air. Venzar's beak parted slightly, but no words came. Ronan straightened. His hands were loose at his sides, but his voice was a blade now, sharp and unyielding. You talk about war fleets, about siege engines and planetary cannons. We had no need for them to become strong. Strength is not measured by the weapons you build, but by the hardships you endure. You believe we have not conquered great foes. He let the words settle before he delivered the final blow. We conquered Earth. A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. One of the Zilari scholars, Professor Xylan Kor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His species, cold and analytical, rarely showed outward reaction, but Ronan caught the subtle tightening of his multi-jointed fingers. Ambassador Dain, Xylan interjected, surely you exaggerate. No intelligent species willingly endures suffering without engineering a way to eliminate it. Your history suggests your people struggled against forces that should have ended them, yet you claim it only made you stronger. Ronan tilted his head slightly, considering the scholar's words. Now we begin. Let me tell you a story. A pulse of curiosity flickered through the room. On Earth, we have a place called the Amazon rainforest. It is a living thing, vast and ancient, In its depths, predators stalk the treetops. Venom seeps from the bark of plants, and the waters carry creatures that kill in silence. It is not a battlefield. It is not a war zone. It is simply nature. And if you are unprepared, it will end you without hesitation. He let that image sink in before continuing. Our ancestors ventured into this place, not as conquerors, but as survivors. They had no claws, no armor, no natural weapons beyond their own wit. They were slow, fragile, soft-skinned creatures in a world that wanted them dead. Venzar scoffed. And yet here you are. Ronan's smile returned. And yet, here we are. He let the weight of the words settle before he delivered the truth that made every alien in the room shift uncomfortably. You see, we did not defeat the rainforest with brute force. We did not outmatch it in strength. We adapted. We studied the poison, not to fear it, but to use it. We learned the patterns of the beasts that stalked us, not to flee, but to hunt them instead. We bent the jungle to our will without ever taming it. And those who could not learn, those who could not change, he shrugged. They died. A cold stillness gripped the room. Zilenkor exhaled softly, his gills flaring as he adjusted his posture. The scholar understood what Ronan was saying. Some of them did, but others refused to see it. Venzar Akesh was among them. A clever story, the Avarian said, though his feathers remained flared. But stories do not change the tides of power. Ronan met his gaze without flinching. No, he admitted, but understanding does. And I am here to help you understand something very important. A beat of silence. You believe we are weak because we lack war fleets and siege engines, because we do not conquer with fire and blade. He let the moment stretch, let them lean in before he gave them the final truth. But humanity did not conquer Earth by being the strongest. We conquered it by being the most dangerous. The air in the chamber had shifted. The tension was no longer simply mockery or dismissal. It was something deeper, something colder. And Ronan saw it. Good. Before any of them could respond, a soft chime echoed through the chamber. A message notification flashed across the laser plasma display embedded in the table before him. Ronan glanced down, and he smiled. Message received. Code red. Assassination order confirmed. Target, Ambassador Ronan Dain. His fingers tapped the screen lightly before he looked up at the gathered aliens once more. Well then, he murmured, now we see who learns fastest. Ronan Dain barely shifted as he studied the message flashing across the laser plasma display in front of him. Assassination order confirmed. Target, Ambassador Ronan Dain. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest. They didn't waste time. He had expected veiled threats, perhaps even a formal protest against his presence. Instead, they skipped the pretense. Several someones had just voted for his immediate elimination. Good. That meant he had their attention. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. A Zalari scribe shifting uneasily in his seat, his three eyes darting between Ronan and Venzar Akesh. The Avarian warlord was still coiled with tension, but his silence spoke volumes. He had come expecting a spectacle, a weakling pleading for his species' place at the table. Instead, he had witnessed something else entirely. A mistake, a miscalculation. The room was different now. The energy had shifted, stretched thin, as if waiting for something to break. Taurus warlord Zarn Vosk, seated at the far end of the chamber, leaned forward slightly, his fingers curling against the metal table. His species thrived on war, fed on conquest like breath. His eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Ronan let the moment stretch, let them believe he was taking in their reactions. In truth, his mind was already elsewhere, breaking down the possibilities. They wouldn't strike here. Too many eyes, too many witnesses. No, they would wait until he was alone, vulnerable. Except Ronan Dain was never vulnerable. He glanced down at the heads-up display, fingers skimming the table's surface. The assassination order carried a tracking code, barely visible, buried beneath layers of encryption. Sloppy. Whoever placed the order hadn't expected him to see it, let alone trace it. He committed the code to memory before shutting the display down. "Chancellor," Ronan finally said, turning his attention back to the highest seat in the chamber. Vreelik Dorn, a being with smooth, translucent skin that pulsed faintly with internal light, had watched the exchange with his usual neutrality. An old politician, far too careful to act without considering the weight of his words. "Yes, Ambassador Dain?" Dorn's voice was as measured as ever, though Ronan didn't miss the way his fingers tightened against the armrest. "I believe it is customary for new Concordium members to provide insight into their world's history," Ronan said evenly. "An opportunity to educate those unfamiliar with our kind. A polite way of saying, let's make them uncomfortable." Dorn inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, if you believe that would serve this discussion." "It will." Ronan turned his gaze back to the assembly, ensuring he met their stares with unwavering calm. They expected him to hesitate, to speak with caution. Instead, he let the words fall like stones into deep water. "You've asked how my people survived," he began. "Why we are here. Let me tell you." He let the silence breathe for a moment before continuing. "Earth does not forgive weakness. It does not nurture its children with soft hands or grant them mercy in the cold." Somewhere in the chamber, a chair creaked. "It is a planet that was born in violence. Our world has torn itself apart more times than I can count. Mountains shattered by forces beyond comprehension, lands drowned beneath towering waves, skies choked with fire and ash. And yet, life never stopped." He let his gaze settle on the Tauris warlord, Zarn Vosk, watching the alien's fingers tap absently against the table. A warrior's impatience. "The creatures that roamed our world in its infancy were not weak. They were titans, beasts so large they could shake the ground with their steps, with maws filled with teeth that could shear bone like parchment." Another pause. He could see it now, the way some of them stiffened, their minds conjuring images of the impossible. "My ancestors?" They were not the strongest. They had no claws, no fangs, no armor of natural plating. Compared to the things that hunted them, they were nothing. And yet, it was the predators that vanished. A shift in the air, unease curling around the edges of the room like smoke. "We learned to outthink them, to strike from the dark, to take what should have killed us and turn it into a weapon. Poison, we extracted it. Fire, we tamed it. Death itself became something we studied, mastered, wielded like a blade." Venzar Akesh had not moved. His golden feathered arms were tight against his frame, his expression unreadable. "You think I am here to plead for my species?" Ronan asked, his voice softer now, more deliberate. "I am here to remind you of something your empires have forgotten." He let his fingers drum once against the metal of the table, a single beat that cut through the stillness. "You sit in this chamber, secure in your rule. You have fought your wars, conquered your worlds, and yet none of you have known true survival. A flicker of offense in the faces of some of the war-hardened species." Ronan leaned forward slightly. "You have always had power, weapons, fleets, structures of dominance that ensured your people never needed to truly fight for their place. We did not have that luxury. We were prey before we were predators. And that is why you should be afraid." His words hung in the air, cold and sharp as a blade unsheathed. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then Zarn Vosk spoke. "You believe fear will grant you respect?" The Tauris warlord's voice was quiet, but the threat in it was unmistakable. Ronan smiled. "I believe understanding will," he countered. "Fear is simply the first step." Vosk's eyes gleamed. A challenge unspoken, but heard nonetheless. The Chancellor's voice cut through the moment. "This session is adjourned." The tension did not break so much as it shifted, a ripple of movement as the assembly began dispersing. Conversations hummed beneath the surface, glances exchanged, calculations forming behind unreadable faces. Ronan stood adjusting the cuffs of his diplomatic uniform. Venzar Akesh was watching him, not with mockery now, nor with the same casual dismissal. Something else, a wariness he had not held before. Good. Ronan turned and strode toward the exit, his mind already shifting gears. Someone had put a bounty on his head. Now he just had to find out who. The game had begun. Ronan Dain walked through the corridors of the Galactic Concordium, his mind sifting through the last session's undercurrents. The weight of unseen forces pressed against him, not just the political machinations of rival factions, but the cold certainty that someone had already decided he wasn't leaving this station alive. The assassination order still lingered in his thoughts. A silent challenge. They thought he would notice. They thought he wouldn't retaliate. They were wrong. His boots echoed lightly against the polished flooring, the air thin and sterilized, stripped of any natural scent. It reminded him of places where survival was dictated not by brute strength, but by knowledge, controlled environments designed to ensure compliance. A glance at the heads-up display on his wrist told him what he already suspected. No official movements against him. Yet. The bounty was fresh, which meant the first attempt would be clumsy, opportunistic. The real threat would come later when those responsible stopped underestimating him. He took a slow breath and exhaled, watching as a Taurus guard at the far end of the corridor shifted slightly, his massive frame adjusting to block a side passage. They were already watching him more closely. Good. That made his job easier. A flicker of movement to his left. Venzar Akesh stood near a high-arched window, his golden-plumed head angled toward the vast cityscape outside. The Avarian's expression was unreadable, his posture controlled, but Ronan didn't miss the slight tension in his shoulders. "You didn't break," Venzar murmured, without looking at him. "I thought you might." Ronan stopped beside him, hands loosely clasped behind his back. "Did you?" The warlord's beak clicked once in response. "No." A pause, but some of them did. A subtle acknowledgement. The Avarian was watching more closely than most. He had seen the shift in the room, the way some of the most skeptical had fallen silent, the way the weight of Ronan's words had left a mark. Ronan turned his head slightly, his reflection catching against the glass-like surface of the window. Below, the city sprawled in layered levels, glowing streams of traffic moving through the corridors of an empire built on centuries of control. A place where power was never given. It was taken. "Do you know who placed the order?" Venzar asked, his voice softer now, a thread of curiosity woven through the words. "I have an idea," Ronan said. It wasn't a lie. He didn't need to know the name yet. The bounty wasn't the real threat. It was the intent behind it. Someone wanted to ensure humanity never had a seat at this table, that the Deathworlder's story ended before it truly began. Venzar studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You're waiting for them to make a move first." Ronan's lips barely curved. "It's always better when they show you their hand before you show them yours." The Avarian gave a quiet click of amusement before finally turning toward him. "Then let me tell you what I saw today." Ronan remained silent, waiting. "They expected you to crumble." Venzar's talons curled lightly at his sides. "Some of them came here today to be entertained, to watch a species beg for recognition, to see how easily you could be dismissed. But that's not what they found." He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. "You made them uneasy, Deathworlder. You gave them something they didn't expect." Ronan tilted his head slightly. "And what was that?" Venzar's yellow eyes gleamed. "A predator that does not need to bare its teeth to be dangerous." A long silence stretched between them before Ronan exhaled quietly. "And where do you stand, Warlord Akesh?" Venzar didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the distant sky, where a fleet of diplomatic vessels hovered, their lights flickering like stars in artificial dusk. "I stand where the wind carries the scent of survival," the Avarian finally said. "And right now, that wind has changed." With that, he turned, his golden feathers catching the glow of the station's high-beamed lights as he strode away. Ronan watched him go, filing away every word, every subtle gesture. A warrior of a warlike species, one that rarely aligned with outsiders, had just admitted that the tides were shifting. A small, almost imperceptible pulse against his wrist caught his attention. A priority transmission. He lifted his heads-up display, a narrow sliver of text appearing in his vision. Security. Alert. Unregistered personnel accessing ambassador quarters. There it was. Without hesitation, Ronan turned and walked, his stride unhurried, controlled. He moved through the corridors with the ease of someone who belonged, even as his mind broke the situation down into possible scenarios. They wouldn't try anything too overt, not yet, not unless they were desperate. As he neared his quarters, the lighting dimmed slightly, shifting into night cycle mode. The door was closed, but the system interface on the side showed activity, a failed override attempt. Ronan's fingers brushed against his belt, where a sleek, compact blade was hidden beneath the fabric. Guns could be traced. Knives were personal. He stepped forward and let the door slide open. The air inside was different. Not a smell, but an absence, like a place where sound had been swallowed, where movement had ceased just a breath too soon. His gaze flicked to the shadows, and he caught the faintest shift, a figure standing motionless near the far wall. Ronan didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, slow and deliberate, and let the door close behind him. A low voice spoke from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come alone." Ronan's fingers brushed the inside of his sleeve. The handle of his blade rested against his palm. He smiled. "I was about to say the same thing." A blur of motion, a glint of steel, a breath drawn in too late. The first mistake had already been made. And it wasn't his. The blade sliced through the air, aimed directly at Ronan's throat. He didn't flinch. Instead, he twisted his body with calculated ease, letting the weapon pass just inches from his skin. The assassin moved fast, too fast for hesitation, too slow to be beyond human reaction. The moment the strike missed, Ronan retaliated. His fingers closed around the hidden knife at his belt. Not an energy weapon, not something sophisticated, just steel and an edge honed to a whisper. It flashed in the dim light as he plunged it forward. The assassin moved, barely escaping the thrust, but it was enough. The moment of imbalance. The loss of control. Ronan drove his shoulder into the attacker's center, slamming him backward into the metallic wall. The impact sent a shudder through the room. A rasp of breath. The figure in front of him shifted, finally stepping into full view. A Taurus. Not a soldier. Something worse. A blade for hire. The kind who didn't ask questions when the contract was sealed. His skin, thick and ridged like tempered armor, had already begun shifting colors, blending with the dimly lit backdrop. Camouflage. The kind that made their kind nearly invisible in the right conditions. It hadn't worked. Ronan stepped back just enough to give the assassin an illusion of space, of hope, before speaking. "You're already dead." The Taurus didn't answer, but Ronan saw the realization in the way his body stiffened, in the way his claws clenched too tightly, as if they could reverse time. A tiny, almost imperceptible red glow blinked on the side of his wrist, a transmitter pulsing in alarm. "Tracking beacon," Ronan murmured, shifting his blade just enough to let the edge catch the faint light. "No assassin carries one willingly." The Tauri's silence was answer enough. He hadn't come to kill. He had come to delay. Ronan exhaled, slow and measured. Then he did something the Taurus wasn't expecting. He stepped forward and let the blade drop. It clattered against the floor, the sound sharp as broken glass against metal. The assassin flinched, his animal instincts battling the reality of what was happening. Ronan moved before the Taurus could decide. His hand shot forward, seizing the assassin's wrist, twisting it sharply, just enough to force the beacon into view. With his free hand, he reached for his heads-up display, syncing it with the pulsing red light. A map flickered into existence. A fleet was moving. They weren't coming for him. They were heading for Earth. A slow, seething burn settled in his chest. Not fear, not panic. Something colder, sharper. Ronan released the Taurus before he had time to process what had happened. "You were sent to keep me here," Ronan said. The assassin swallowed. "I was sent to ensure you weren't a factor." Ronan took a step back, exhaling through his nose. "You failed." And then he turned, stepping toward the heads-up display embedded in the wall, ignoring the assassin as if he no longer mattered. He sent the transmission before the Tauris had fully processed his own irrelevance. The display screen pulsed once before connecting. A voice, thick with tension, filled the room. "Ambassador Dain?" Ronan's grip on the console tightened. "Status." A pause, the kind that came when a man knew his next words would change the course of something vast and irreversible. "We have incoming." Ronan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Taurus warships, moving fast. Too fast for diplomacy to be their intent. They had decided to make their move, and they thought Earth was unprepared. Ronan exhaled. "Send the message." Another pause. The voice on the other end hesitated, then followed the order. A second later, a new message pulsed across the screen. "Transmission sent. Encryption. Level black. Recipient. Earth High Command." It had begun. Ronan turned back to the Tauris assassin, studying the way his chest rose and fell, the way his shoulders sagged just slightly. He knew. "It won't matter," the assassin said finally, his voice hoarse. "They have more ships, more weapons. You can't—" Ronan held up a hand. "Stop!" The Tory's mouth snapped shut. Ronan tilted his head slightly, considering the alien in front of him, not as an enemy, not as a threat, but as a puzzle that had already solved itself. "You misunderstand," Ronan said, stepping forward, his voice quiet but unwavering. The Tauri swallowed. "You think this was your war to win," Ronan continued, "that your kind held the advantage. That strength is measured in fleet numbers and siege power." The assassin flinched as Ronan's shadow fell over him. Ronan crouched slightly, lowering himself to eye level. "You don't know what you've done," Ronan whispered. The Tauris blinked, and then, before he could answer, Ronan stood and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The corridor stretched ahead, its polished metal reflecting the cold glow of overhead lights. Ronan Dain walked without hurry, though each measured step felt like the ticking of a countdown. The war had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. His heads-up display flickered against his wrist, feeding him streams of data in real time. Taurus warships had already begun their advance. Fast, aggressive, a tactic meant to overwhelm. They weren't giving Earth the option of negotiations. They were making a mistake. A door slid open before him, revealing the private war chamber of the Concordium's highest-ranking officials. Chancellor Vrylik Dorn stood at the head of the long, circular table, his translucent skin shifting faintly as his internal bioluminescence pulsed with tension. Around him, representatives from the dominant factions whispered, their voices like the hush before a storm. They knew. The first strike had been made, and now they were deciding whether to watch or intervene. Ronan didn't sit. Instead, he placed both hands on the table, letting his gaze pass over each figure in the room. Some met his stare, others turned away. He let the silence stretch before speaking. "The Tauris Dominion has declared war on Earth," he said. The words weren't an accusation. They were a fact, laid bare, a stone placed on the weight of history. Minister Halden Rear, a reptilian diplomat from the Zyrex Collective, flicked his tongue as his dark eyes narrowed. "An assumption. No formal war declaration has been recorded." Ronan tilted his head slightly. "That's the point of an ambush, Minister Rear. They don't send invitations." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Rear's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Chancellor Dorn folded his hands. "We have yet to see proof that this is a full-scale invasion. Skirmishes happen. You should be careful not to interpret conflict where diplomacy could still hold." Ronan's jaw tightened just slightly. "You think this is a border dispute?" His voice remained steady, but the edges of his words sharpened. "Tell me, Chancellor, how many times in the history of this council has a Deathworlder species been granted equal standing?" Silence. None. Ronan straightened. This was never about politics. It was never about power struggles between the factions. This was about fear. A sharp inhale came from somewhere down the table. Ronan didn't look away from Dorn. "Earth is an anomaly. You've studied us. dissected our history, watched us rise from a planet that should have buried us beneath its storms and its predators. His voice was softer now, but it carried through the chamber. And now we stand here, unbroken, unbowed, and that terrifies you. Dorn's fingers flexed slightly against the table. You sit in your towers and your colonies, Ronan continued, stepping away from the table now, moving slowly, deliberately. Your empires were built on stability, order, the comfort of knowing that power moves in predictable patterns. He exhaled. We disrupt that. We are a species that does not conquer, yet we refuse to be conquered. We build, but we are not fragile. And because of that, some of you will do anything to keep us from claiming our place here. The weight of his words settled into the bones of the room, and then General Zarn Vosk spoke. The warlord had been silent until now, his hulking frame seated at the farthest end of the table. His red eyes gleamed as he studied Ronan, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a slow, deliberate drawl. You speak of fear as if it is a weakness, Vosk said, tapping one thick finger against the table. But you misunderstand something, Ambassador. He leaned forward slightly. It is not fear that makes us wary of your kind. Ronan tilted his head slightly, then enlightened me. Vosk's lips pulled back in something that was neither a smile nor a threat, but somewhere in between. It is the unknown, Vosk murmured, and unknowns have a way of turning the tide. The words hung between them. Ronan held his gaze for a long moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, he lifted his wrist and tapped a single command on his heads-up display. The table before them flickered, and a three-dimensional laser plasma display flared to life in the center of the chamber. A fleet. Taurus warships, already en route to Earth. Their formations were unmistakable. This was not a tactical maneuver. This was a kill strike. The murmurs in the chamber became something else now, not doubt, but realization. Ronan turned back to the Chancellor. Your options are simple, he said, his voice steady. Do nothing, and let the Tauri's dominion shatter the illusion of balance you claim to uphold. Or step in now, and remind them that war without consequence is not diplomacy. It's conquest. Dorn's expression darkened. You assume the Council will side with Earth? Ronan exhaled, slow and measured. Now was the moment. The final move before the board shifted. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words felt weighted. I assume, he said, that some of you have already calculated the cost of ignoring this. Dorn didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the war had already begun, and now the Concordium had to decide if they would fight it or be consumed by it. The chamber had not yet exhaled. The weight of Ronan Dain's words still clung to the air, thick as storm clouds, before the first crack of lightning. Around the circular table, representatives of the Galactic Empires shifted, their expressions carved from stone, their thoughts a battlefield of calculations and unspoken fears. Chancellor Vrylik Dorn's translucent skin pulsed in muted ripples, betraying the tension he had not yet put into words. Ronan did not sit. He did not waver. His hands rested lightly against the cold metal of the war table, fingers curled just enough to suggest control, but never desperation. Across from him, General Zarn Vosk's crimson eyes flickered like embers, reading the space between words, weighing possibilities, searching for leverage. The three-dimensional laser plasma display of the incoming Taurus fleet still rotated in the chamber's center, its crimson markers edging closer to Earth with every passing second. The silence cracked. The Taurus Dominion does not act without confidence, Minister Halden Rior rasped, his reptilian tongue flicking over serrated teeth. They believe this will be over before a single retaliatory fleet can be mobilized. Do they know something we do not? Ronan's gaze did not shift. They know fear has made you complacent. The reptilian minister's throat expanded slightly, a sign of irritation, but Ronan did not allow the conversation to spiral. He turned his attention back to Dorn. You believe this can be solved through delay, Ronan said evenly. Through negotiation. But the Tauris are not diplomats. They are conquerors dressed in the trappings of civility, and their warships are already en route. If this council does not act, Earth will burn. And then what? His voice was softer now, edged with something colder than anger. Do you think they will stop there? Dorn's fingers tapped once against the table's surface, a minuscule motion, yet it carried the weight of a decision forming. General Vosk exhaled, his massive form shifting as he leaned forward. You assume humanity has the strength to resist? Ronan met his gaze with the unshaken certainty of a man who had already played this game 1,000 times over in his mind. You assume Earth has shown its full hand? Vosk studied him, and for the first time, something like amusement flickered beneath the weight of his scrutiny. A sharp chime split through the chamber. A new transmission. The laser plasma display flickered, shifting the incoming feed to the center of the room. A Terran officer's face replaced the star charts, her expression carved from steel, her uniform immaculate. Behind her, the command deck of a warship glowed with activity, figures moving in crisp, disciplined coordination, instruments casting reflections across the smooth surface of her high collar. Admiral Cala Voss, Terran High Command, she announced, her voice carrying across the chamber like the first drumbeat of war. Transmission level black. Dorn's gaze flicked toward Ronan. Level black is reserved for full mobilization orders. It is, Ronan confirmed, and for the first time he allowed himself a smile that did not reach his eyes. Because the Tories have made a fatal error. Cala Voss inclined her head slightly. Per diplomatic authorization, we have confirmed the presence of enemy warships in interstellar space approaching Earth's perimeter. However, her pause was a needle drawn slow across the skin, the anticipation beneath it electric. They are not alone. The laser plasma display split into multiple angles, revealing a formation hidden just beyond the Taurus fleet. Shadows in the deep, moving with intent, unmarked, unreadable. They believe themselves the only predators in this space, Voss continued. They are wrong. The chamber stilled. General Vosk's fingers curled against the table, his expression unreadable. What are those ships? Ronan's pulse remained steady. Insurance. Silence, thick and sharp-edged. Dorn's voice was a measured drawl. You didn't come here simply to seek aid. You came here knowing Earth was already playing the board. Ronan's gaze remained locked on the display. I came here knowing this council would hesitate. And hesitation, Chancellor, is death. Minister Rayor exhaled, a slow, calculated breath. And what, exactly, are we looking at? Ronan inclined his head toward Voss. She did not hesitate. Earth's true strength has never been in brute force, she said, her voice crisp. It has been in adaptability, in preparation, in ensuring we are never caught off guard. The laser plasma display zoomed in on the unknown ships, detailing their formation, the way they drifted just outside sensor range, watching, waiting. Humanity has never been alone in its struggle, Ronan said, folding his hands behind his back. The Tauris assume Earth is weak because they see only what we allow them to see. They do not see the agreements made in the dark, the debts collected, the allies who have no interest in sitting at this table, but every interest in ensuring the Dominion does not overreach. Vosk's voice was quiet. You have hidden war fleets. No, Ronan said simply. We have given other predators a reason to hunt. Dorn's posture remained still, but Ronan did not miss the subtle shift in his expression, a realization settling into place. You baited them, the Chancellor murmured. Ronan did not confirm it, but the truth was there, hanging between them. Cala Voss's expression did not waver. If this council chooses neutrality, we will not ask for intervention. But understand this, humanity will not fall today. And when the Taurus Dominion is left bleeding from a war they believed would be effortless, the ones who remained silent will be forced to make a choice. Dorn exhaled. And what choice is that? Ronan's voice was quiet, but unshakable. To recognize that the balance of power has already shifted. A beat of silence. Then Vosk exhaled something between a chuckle and a snarl, leaning back in his seat. You are dangerous, Deathworlder. Ronan's lips barely quirked. You're only realizing that now? Dorn stood. The motion, slow and deliberate, sent a ripple through the chamber. "The Council will reconvene within the hour," the Chancellor announced. "Decisions must be made." The message was clear. Ronan nodded once. "Then I suggest you make them quickly." And with that he turned, his mind already a dozen steps ahead. The first stone had been cast. Now they would see where the ripples reached. Ronan Dain strode out of the chamber, the scent of sterilized metal and polished stone filling his lungs. The corridors of the Galactic Concordium hummed with subdued energy, diplomatic envoys whispering in tight circles, their voices clipped and urgent. They had seen the laser plasma display. They knew what was coming. He stepped into the transit lift, the walls around him shifting from translucent to opaque, sealing him inside. His fingers hovered over the control interface, but before he could select a destination, a voice cut through the silence. "You knew they'd hesitate," Venzar Akash murmured, standing just beyond the entrance, his golden-feathered arms crossed. "You played this council like a war game before you even stepped into that chamber." Ronan met his gaze, studying the warlord's stance, no longer dismissive, no longer looking at him as a diplomat out of his depth. Venzar saw it now, the way the pieces had moved before the board had even been set. "They hesitated because they assumed they had the luxury of time," Ronan said. "Now they're realizing that luxury was never theirs to begin with." Venzar stepped into the lift, the doors sealing shut behind him. The weight of the warlord's presence carried the sharp edge of an unspoken question. "You have ships hiding in the void. Forces the Concordium never accounted for," Venzar said, tilting his head slightly. "How long have you been preparing for this?" Ronan's lips barely twitched. "Long enough." The lift descended, a near-silent glide through the station's inner levels. As it slowed, the display at Ronan's wrist pulsed, a direct transmission from Kala Voss. He opened the channel. "Status. Outer perimeter defense lines are locked," Voss's voice came through, controlled and clipped. "We've positioned our assets along the anticipated Taurus approach vector. They won't see them until it's too late." "Casualty projections?" Voss exhaled softly. "Minimal, if they take the bait." "They will," Ronan said. Venzar shifted beside him, his gaze unreadable. "And if they don't?" "Then we ensure they have no alternative," Ronan said simply. The lift doors slid open, revealing the War Operations Chamber, a command center embedded deep within the Concordium station. The room was dimly lit, the glow of laser plasma displays casting shifting patterns against the polished steel walls. Officers moved in efficient silence, their heads bent over data feeds and tactical overlays. Ronan walked to the central console where a three-dimensional projection of the approaching Taurus fleet rotated in stark red. Their formation was aggressive, tightly packed, designed for overwhelming force, not maneuverability. "Show me the outer markers," he instructed. The display zoomed outward, revealing the hidden fleet lying in wait. They were positioned just beyond the Tauri's sensors, nestled inside electromagnetic disturbances that masked their signatures. Each ship was strategically placed, forming a net that would collapse the moment the Tauris committed to their charge. Venzar narrowed his eyes. "You're forcing them into a kill box." Ronan nodded. "They'll assume they're dictating the battle, that their momentum will break Earth's defenses before a counteroffensive can be mounted. But momentum means nothing if it carries you straight into a wall." A new transmission flickered onto the display, an intelligence officer, her uniform crisp, her expression taut with focus. "Ambassador, we've intercepted their command frequency." "Patch it through," Ronan said. A moment later the channel cracked to life. The guttural voice of a Taurus commander filtered through, layered with static, the weight of his certainty bleeding into every word. "Strike with full force. Earth's defenses are spread too thin to hold. We crush them before they can respond." Ronan exhaled slowly, letting the words settle. The Tauris believed this would be over in hours. "How long until they breach engagement range?" he asked. Voss's response was immediate. "Less than 30 minutes." The Tauris fleet was already committed. No retreat, no recalibration. "Then we begin," Ronan said. He tapped a command into the display. The hidden Earth fleet adjusted its positioning, closing the net. Venzar studied the tactical overlay, his golden eyes flickering with something Ronan recognized, respect, edged with wariness. "You planned this not just as a defense," the warlord murmured, his feathers ruffling slightly. "You designed this as a lesson." Ronan met his gaze. "A lesson they won't survive to forget." The next transmission came from the Concordium's diplomatic wing. Dorn's voice, carefully measured. "The Council has reached a decision." Ronan did not move, did not acknowledge the thinly veiled tension in the Chancellor's tone. "And?" A pause. Then Dorn spoke, each syllable deliberate. "The Galactic Concordium will not intervene. Officially, this is a conflict between two independent forces." Ronan allowed himself a slow inhale, letting the words settle into place. The Council would watch, take no side, at least not yet. Venzar's beak clicked softly. "They want to see if you can win without them." Ronan's mouth curved slightly, though the expression carried no warmth. "Then we make sure they have their answer." He turned back to the display. The Tauri's fleet had entered the engagement zone. "Trigger Phase 1, he ordered. The display shifted. The hidden Earth forces came alive. Within seconds, the Tauri's commanders would see it, would realize, too late, that the battlefield had never belonged to them. A transmission cut through the operations room, filled with static and panic. Taurus voices, their certainty fracturing into something raw and unsteady. "Unidentified warships, breaking formation. Where did they—" The feed snapped into silence. Venzar let out a slow breath. "And just like that, the hunters become prey." Ronan did not respond. He watched as the net collapsed around the Tauri's forces, as Earth ships maneuvered with ruthless efficiency. Every escape route had been sealed before the battle had even begun. A new display flickered onto the console, real-time visuals of Taurus warships struggling to reposition, their formations breaking apart. Voss's voice came through, calm and unyielding. "Their lead ships are attempting emergency jumps." "Let them," Ronan said. "The survivors will be the ones who carry the message." Venzar studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a slow, measured nod. "You're not fighting for survival," he murmured. "You're fighting to make sure they never try this again." Ronan met his gaze. "Survival," he said quietly, "was never the goal." The Tauri's fleet shattered, and the galaxy had just learned its lesson. The Tauri's fleet had crumbled. The last warships, those that had not been torn apart by the trap waiting for them, were limping away, leaving behind shattered hulls and fractured lines. Wreckage drifted in cold silence, the once imposing armada reduced to a warning written in debris. The galactic empires had watched it unfold. They had seen the unthinkable. Humanity, the so-called fragile species, had not only survived, but orchestrated the kind of tactical slaughter that rewrote the rules of war. Ronan Dain stood in the war operations chamber, eyes fixed on the laser plasma display detailing the aftermath. The Tauri's remnants had broken rank, scattering in blind retreat. Some had sent distress signals to allied empires, seeking refuge. Others had gone dark entirely, choosing exile over the disgrace of returning to a dominion that would not forgive failure. The Council had remained silent. Even as the battle shifted, even as the warships fell, the Chancellor and his assembly had watched with the neutrality of scavengers, waiting to see which carcass would be left for them to pick apart. But now, that silence was about to end. A new transmission flickered into existence. Chancellor Vrylik Dorn's expression was carefully measured, his translucent skin pulsing with barely concealed calculation. His voice, when it came, was smooth as polished steel. "Ambassador Dain, it would appear the Tauri's forces have been neutralized." Ronan did not answer immediately. He let the weight of the words settle, let the silence stretch long enough for Dorn to feel the shift in power. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but unyielding. "It would appear so." Venzar Akesh watched from the corner of the room, golden feathers slicked back in sharp contemplation. He had seen countless wars, had led fleets that burned planets to embers, and yet he had not spoken since the moment the Tauri's fleet broke. Now, his beak parted slightly. "The Council will not like what has happened here." Ronan turned to him, meeting the warlord's gaze with a look that held no uncertainty. "The Council doesn't have to like it. They only have to understand it." Dorn's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers curled slightly against the armrest of his high seat. "And what, exactly, do you wish them to understand?" Ronan stepped forward, the movement deliberate, the moment sharpened into something absolute. He had played their game, maneuvered through their politics and their veiled threats, but now there would be no room left for interpretation. "That Earth is not a bargaining chip," he said, "not a token species to be ignored, not a fragile anomaly that can be erased from the board when convenient." His voice did not rise, but it carried through the chamber like the cold bite of a blade pressed against skin. "You watched as the Tauri's dominion made its move. You did nothing. You waited to see if humanity would break, if we would become a footnote in your history books." Dorn did not flinch, but something in his posture had changed. Ronan saw it, the quiet realization that no matter how this conversation ended, the galaxy had already shifted beneath their feet. Venzar exhaled through his beak. "And yet, here you are." Ronan let the words settle before answering. "Here we are." A flicker of movement from the laser plasma display. A secondary fleet, not human, not Taurus. Observers. The other empires, those who had remained neutral, were now repositioning, shifting their alliances, recalculating. The moment they had feared had arrived, and they were grasping for stability in a galaxy that had just proven itself unstable. Dorn's fingers tapped once against the console. "You expect them to fear you." Ronan's gaze did not waver. "I expect them to respect us." A pause. Then Dorn exhaled slowly, his translucent skin shifting in a faint ripple of what might have been unease. "You have made a dangerous precedent here, Ambassador." Ronan stepped forward, placing his hands on the war table, the glow of the display casting long shadows across his face. You made it the moment you assumed we would be the ones to fall." Dorn studied him, then the shattered remains of the Tauri's fleet still displayed in rotating patterns of wreckage and ruined strategy. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, the first true sign of concession. "What is it you want, Dain?" A slow inhale. The words that followed were not spoken in anger, nor in threat, but in the quiet, unwavering certainty of a species that had already conquered the most merciless battlefield of all, its own home world. "We will not ask for a seat at your table," Ronan said. "We will take it." Venzar let out a low, amused click, his feathers ruffling slightly. "A bold claim." "It is not a claim," Ronan corrected. "It is an inevitability." Dorn exhaled. He was an old politician, and old politicians knew when they had lost the battle. His expression remained schooled, but his words carried the weight of finality. "Then it would seem the Council has its answer." Ronan did not move as the transmission cut out. He did not celebrate, did not exhale in relief. There was nothing to celebrate. Venzar regarded him for a long moment, his warlord's gaze carrying something that might have been respect, might have been wariness. "You didn't just fight to survive today," he said finally. Ronan turned to him, meeting his gaze with something far colder, far sharper. Survival was never the goal. Venzar inclined his head slightly, as if seeing him for the first time. "And what is?" Ronan's lips barely curved. "To ensure they never forget." Outside, the wreckage of the Tauri's fleet drifted in silent testimony. The Council had seen, the other empires had seen, and now the message was written in the scars left behind. Humanity had arrived, and they would never be underestimated again.